President Donald Trump's administration has asked a federal appeals court to block a judge's order that it distribute November's full monthly SNAP food benefits. The judge gave the Trump administration until Friday to make the payments. The administration wants to continue with planned partial SNAP payments for the month. Because of the government shutdown, the Trump administration originally had said that SNAP benefits would not be available in November. However, two judges ruled last week that the administration could not skip November's benefits entirely. In both cases, the judges ordered the government to use one emergency reserve fund containing more than $4.6 billion to pay for SNAP for November. But the administration asked the appeals court to suspend any court orders requiring it to spend more money than is available in a contingency fund, saying it was up to Congress to appropriate the funds for the program. The court wrangling prolonged weeks of uncertainty for the food program that serves about 1 in 8 Americans, mostly with lower incomes.
Okay, so picture this. You're Donald Trump. Your entire agenda is falling apart. Federal courts are ruling against you left and right on food stamps, on tariffs, on emergency powers. Everything you've tried to do, courts are blocking. Judges are saying you exceeded your authority, that you violated the law, that your policies are unconstitutional, and you're desperate because if these rulings stand, your entire presidency looks like a failure. Your signature economic policies get struck down. Your approach to executive power gets rejected. Your legacy crumbles. So you do what you always do when you're losing. You run to the Supreme Court, you file emergency appeals, asking the justices to block lower court rulings, to stop judges from enforcing orders, requiring you to restore food stamp funding, to prevent courts from striking down your tariffs. You're begging the Supreme Court to save you, to overrule lower courts, to let you continue policies that judges have already found illegal, and you're not subtle about it. You're calling the tariff case life or death for the United States, saying that if the Supreme Court rules against you, it will destroy the United States, making it sound like the fate of the nation depends on the Supreme Court letting you keep your tariffs. And legal experts are watching this desperation play out. They see Trump scrambling. They see him losing in lower courts. They see him running to the Supreme Court as a last resort. And they're noting that Trump's appeals are weak, that the lower court rulings are solid, that the Supreme Court might not save him. So Trump is facing the real possibility that his entire policy agenda gets struck down, that courts reject his use of executive power, that his presidency is defined by judicial defeats, and there's nothing he can do except beg the Supreme Court to rescue him. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
More than 42 million Americans do receive these benefits, 1 in 8 people in the United States. So this is a big deal for a lot of folks. So let's talk about the latest developments today in the legal case. So yesterday, the judge, like you said, ordered the federal government, specifically the Department of Agriculture, to dip into another pool of money. It's called Section 32 WIC, commonly referred to as Women, Infants, and Children. So this is a separate pool of money. There's $23 billion there. And the judge said, you have to dip into this other pool to pay the SNAP benefits. Why does that matter? Well, that program typically costs the government about $3 billion a month. So there's a lot of money there that can come backfill this shortfall. We know the SNAP program costs the federal government approximately $8.5 to $9 billion a month. So this additional money could potentially fund the program through the end of the year. Now, the federal government is saying that this is unlawful. You can't force the government to pull from one pool of money to pay for another. Now, this Section 32 program, it was funded by 1932 congressional law called the Agriculture Adjustment Act. And the second argument that the government is making is that this is a judge telling Congress to appropriate funds and to spend money. And the nonprofits that sued in the cities, they said, no, this money has already been apportioned. It just has to be spent. And the USDA is refusing to do so. Today, the government filed an appeal and asked for an emergency stay. A stay would be putting that lower court's ruling on hold.
This is wild. This is absolutely devastating for Trump, because when you're losing in every court, when judges across the country are ruling against you, running to the Supreme Court doesn't look strong. It looks desperate. It shows you're out of options. That the only chance you have is getting the most conservative court in modern history to bail you out. So let's talk about it. Let's break down what court rulings Trump is appealing, why he lost in lower courts, what he's asking the Supreme Court to do, and why this represents the collapse of Trump's legal and policy strategy. Because trust me, this is huge. This is Trump's agenda being dismantled by courts. This is judicial rejection of Trump's approach to presidential power, and even the Supreme Court might not be able to save him. Now, Trump is facing multiple damning court rulings that he's appealing to the Supreme Court. Let's break them down. The food stamp ruling. On November 7, 2025, federal judges ordered Trump's administration to fully restore food stamp funding. Trump had been trying to cut SNAP benefits to reduce federal spending on food assistance, but courts found that Trump's cuts violated federal law, that the administration didn't have authority to unilaterally reduce benefits, so judges ordered Trump to restore full funding, and Trump immediately appealed to the Supreme Court, asked for an emergency stay, blocking the lower court order. Basically, Trump asked the court to let him continue withholding food stamps while he appeals, and the Supreme Court granted a temporary emergency block, meaning for now, Trump doesn't have to restore funding, but that's temporary. The court will eventually have to decide the case, and if they side with lower courts, Trump will have to restore benefits. And millions of families are caught in the middle, waiting to see if their food assistance gets restored or remains cut. The tariffs ruling. This is the big one, the one Trump is calling life or death. Lower courts have ruled that most of Trump's tariffs are illegal, that Trump used emergency powers to impose tariffs without congressional approval, that he exceeded his constitutional authority, and those rulings would strike down Trump's signature economic policy, would require refunds of billions of dollars in tariff revenue, would eliminate Trump's main tool for implementing his trade agenda. So Trump appealed to the Supreme Court, and the court agreed to hear the case. Arguments already happened, and Trump is waiting for a decision, but he's terrified, because if the court strikes down his tariffs, that's a massive blow to his economic policy, to his claim of strong executive authority, to his entire presidency. So Trump is publicly warning that the court's decision is life or death, that if they rule against him, it will destroy the United States, which is obviously hyperbole, but it shows how desperate Trump is, how much he needs the court to rule in his favor. Other emergency powers cases, Trump has been using emergency declarations to implement various policies, immigration restrictions, military deployments, spending redirections, and courts have been striking down many of these actions, finding that Trump's emergencies aren't real emergencies, that he's abusing emergency powers to circumvent Congress, and Trump is appealing these rulings too, asking the Supreme Court to let him continue using emergency powers broadly. So Trump is basically asking the Supreme Court to save his entire presidency, to overrule lower courts on multiple fronts, to let him continue policies that judges have found illegal, and he's doing it desperately, publicly warning about catastrophic consequences if the court doesn't rule his way, framing everything as existential threats. And the Supreme Court is in a difficult position, because they could rule for Trump, could overrule lower courts, could say that presidents have broader authority than lower courts recognize, but that would be controversial, would look like the court is bailing out Trump politically, would undermine the lower court rulings that found Trump's actions illegal, or they could rule against Trump, could affirm lower courts, could say Trump exceeded his authority, but Trump and his supporters would attack the court, would claim the justices betrayed conservatism, would call them part of the deep state. So either way, the court faces backlash, and Trump has put them in that position by losing so consistently in lower courts, by having such weak legal arguments that judges keep ruling against him. Now, lower courts haven't been subtle in their criticism of Trump. Judges have found that Trump's administration showed intent to defy court orders, that Trump's lawyers made misleading arguments, that Trump's policies violated clear statutory requirements. Those are harsh findings. Those are judges saying Trump isn't just wrong on the law. He's deliberately trying to violate it. He's ignoring court orders. He's acting in bad faith. And when lower courts make findings like that, it's hard for the Supreme Court to overturn them, because the Supreme Court generally defers to lower courts on factual findings, on determinations about what happened and what parties intended. So if lower courts found Trump was deliberately defying orders, the Supreme Court is unlikely to second guess that, which means Trump's appeals face an uphill battle, even at a conservative Supreme Court. So yeah, this is the story. Trump hit with damning rulings in multiple cases, lower courts striking down his food stamp cuts, his tariffs, his emergency powers, Trump immediately running to the Supreme Court for help, filing emergency appeals, begging justices to block lower court orders, calling cases life or death, and facing the real possibility that even the Supreme Court won't save him. Let's break it down. All right, so let's dig into why Trump lost in lower courts and what his appeals to the Supreme Court actually argue. because understanding the legal issues helps explain why Trump is in such trouble and why the Supreme Court might not save him. Let's start with the food stamp case. Trump's administration tried to cut SNAP benefits. The administration argued that states were administering the program too generously, that too many people were receiving benefits, that federal spending needed to be reduced, so the administration issued new rules restricting SNAP eligibility and reducing benefit amounts. But federal courts found those changes violated the law. Why? Because Congress set SNAP policy through statutes. The administration can't just unilaterally change program rules. The administration argued they had regulatory authority, that they were just implementing the statute differently, but courts found the changes went beyond regulatory discretion, that they fundamentally altered the program in ways Congress hadn't authorized. Courts also found the administration didn't follow proper procedures. Federal law requires agencies to go through notice and comment rulemaking, to publish proposed rules, to accept public comments, to respond to concerns, and the administration tried to skip or rush through those procedures. So courts found the rules were not only unauthorized, but also procedurally defective, and courts ordered the administration to restore full SNAP funding, to go back to the previous rules while they go through proper procedures. That's a standard remedy. When an agency acts illegally, courts restore the status quo. But Trump's administration appealed to the Supreme Court and asked for an emergency stay. The administration argued that restoring funding immediately would cause administrative chaos, that states would struggle to adjust, that it would cost billions of dollars, and the Supreme Court granted a temporary stay, allowing Trump to continue the cuts while the appeal proceeds. But that's just temporary. Eventually, the Supreme Court will have to decide whether the lower courts were right, whether Trump's cuts violated the law, and based on the legal standards, the lower courts are probably right, because agencies do have to follow statutes, do have to go through proper procedures, and if Trump's administration didn't do that, the courts were correct to strike down the rules. So Trump's chances on appeal aren't great, but millions of families are waiting to find out, because if the Supreme Court sides with lower courts, benefits get restored. But if the court sides with Trump, cuts continue. Now let's talk about the tariffs case in detail. This is Trump's most important appeal, the one he's calling life or death. Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on imports from many countries. He used emergency powers, specifically the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act. Trump claimed that trade deficits and economic competition constituted national security threats, that they justified emergency tariffs. And for a while, those tariffs remained in place, but they were challenged in court, and multiple lower courts ruled they were illegal. Why? Because Trump's justifications don't meet the statutory requirements for emergency powers. I.e., EPA requires a genuine national emergency, not just economic conditions Trump doesn't like. Section 232 requires a real national security threat, not just trade imbalances. Courts found that Trump stretched these statutes beyond their intended scope, that he used them to implement trade policy that should require congressional approval, and courts found that allowing Trump's interpretation would give presidents unlimited power over trade, would let them impose any tariffs they want by just declaring emergencies. That violates the Constitution. The Constitution gives Congress power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Congress can delegate some authority to presidents, but that delegation has limits, and Trump exceeded those limits. So courts struck down many of Trump's tariffs, ruled them illegal, and ordered that tariff revenue be refunded. That's billions of dollars. Companies that paid tariffs would get refunds, and Trump couldn't collect more tariffs under these authorities. That's devastating for Trump's trade policy, for his economic agenda, for his claim to be tough on China and other countries. So Trump appealed to the Supreme Court, and the court agreed to hear the case. Arguments happened on November 5th, 2025, and now everyone is waiting for a decision. Trump is terrified the court will rule against him. That's why he's calling it life or death. Why he's warning that a loss would destroy the United States. But legal experts who watch the arguments think Trump is in trouble, because even conservative justices express skepticism, ask tough questions about limits on presidential power, question whether Trump's emergencies were real. So it's possible the Supreme Court will rule against Trump, will say he exceeded his authority, will affirm the lower court ruling striking down his tariffs, and that would be a massive defeat, not just for Trump's trade policy, but for his entire approach to executive power. Now let's talk about the other emergency powers cases. Trump has used emergency declarations extensively to redirect military construction funds to build border wall, to impose immigration restrictions, to deploy National Guard troops, to implement various policies without congressional approval, and courts have been striking down many of these actions, finding that Trump's emergencies aren't real emergencies, that he's abusing emergency powers to do things Congress won't authorize, that his actions violate statutes or the Constitution. Trump has appealed many of these rulings, and some have reached the Supreme Court. The border wall funding case went to the Supreme Court, and the court allowed some of Trump's actions to proceed, but that was before all the facts were developed, before lower courts made detailed findings about Trump's abuse of authority. Now, with more evidence of Trump's pattern of misusing emergency powers, the Supreme Court might be less sympathetic, especially after the Portland ruling, where a judge permanently blocked Trump from deploying troops. That shows courts are willing to constrain Trump's emergency powers, and the Supreme Court might affirm those constraints. Now, let's talk about Trump's strategy with these appeals. Why run to the Supreme Court? Because Trump has no other options. He's lost in lower courts. Trial courts ruled against him. Appellate courts affirmed. So the Supreme Court is his last chance. Trump is hoping conservative justices will bail him out, will say that presidents need broad authority, will overturn lower court rulings. Trump is trying to delay. Even if Trump ultimately loses at the Supreme Court, the appeals process takes time, months or even years, and during that time, Trump's policies can sometimes continue, especially if the court grants emergency stays. Trump is making political arguments, calling cases life or death, warning about catastrophic consequences, trying to pressure justices politically. But that strategy is risky because Supreme Court justices don't like being pressured. They don't like parties making public political appeals. It can backfire, make justices less sympathetic to Trump. And Trump's arguments are often exaggerated. Claiming that striking down his tariffs will destroy the United States is obviously false. The U.S. existed without Trump's tariffs before, would continue existing if they're struck down. So Trump's hyperbolic warnings undermine his credibility with the court. Now let's talk about why Trump keeps losing in lower courts. If Trump's legal positions were strong, he'd win more often. But he's losing consistently. Why? Because Trump's lawyers make weak arguments. They're often not supported by statutory language or precedent. They rely on broad claims of presidential power that courts reject because Trump's actions often violate clear legal requirements. When statutes say agencies must do certain things and Trump doesn't do them, courts rule against him. Because Trump doesn't follow proper procedures, even when presidents have discretion, they have to follow administrative law procedures, notice and comment rulemaking, environmental review, considering alternatives. Trump often skips these, and courts strike down his actions for procedural violations. Because judges don't trust Trump's administration, after repeated instances of false statements to courts, after patterns of defying court orders, judges are skeptical of Trump's representations, more willing to rule against him. So Trump's consistent losses in lower courts reflect real legal problems, not just biased judges. Trump is actually violating laws, and courts are holding him accountable. Now, there's a question of whether the Supreme Court will be more sympathetic. The Supreme Court is conservative. Trump appointed 3 justices, so maybe they'll rule for him, even when lower courts ruled against him. But that's not guaranteed, because even conservative justices care about rule of law, about following statutes, about maintaining institutional legitimacy. And if Trump's positions are clearly wrong legally, even conservative justices might rule against him. We've seen this already. The Supreme Court has ruled against Trump in some cases. The court rejected some of Trump's immigration policies, rejected attempts to end DACA, ruled against Trump in some financial records cases, so Trump can't count on automatic support from the Supreme Court. The justices might agree with Trump on some policy goals, but if his legal arguments are weak, they'll rule against him. And in the tariffs case, based on oral arguments, it sounds like Trump is in trouble. Justices ask tough questions, express skepticism about Trump's claims of authority, so Trump might lose, might see his tariffs struck down, and that will be devastating for his presidency and legacy. So yeah, this is where we are. Trump hit with multiple damning court rulings, lower court striking down his policies across multiple areas, Trump running to the Supreme Court as a last resort, filing emergency appeals, making desperate public statements, and facing the real possibility that even the Supreme Court won't save him. Let's talk about what that means. Okay, so let's break down what happens if the Supreme Court rules against Trump, what it means for his presidency, his policies, and his legacy. Because these cases aren't just about specific policies, they're about the scope of presidential power. First, let's talk about the tariffs case. If the Supreme Court strikes down Trump's tariffs, the consequences are massive. Trump's tariffs will be declared illegal. Companies would get refunds. Billions of dollars in tariff revenue would have to be returned. That creates huge budgetary problems. Trump couldn't impose new tariffs using emergency powers. He'd need congressional approval, and Congress might not give it. Democrats control or influence Congress enough to block, so Trump's trade policy would be gutted, his main economic tool removed. Trump's entire approach to executive power gets rejected. The court would be saying presidents can't use emergency powers this broadly, that congressional authority over commerce matters, that constitutional limits on presidential power are real, that constrains Trump on other issues too, immigration, military deployments. any area where Trump has claimed broad emergency powers. The court's tariffs ruling would establish that those powers have limits. Trump's presidency looks like a failure. His signature economic policy struck down by courts. His claims of strong leadership undermined. His legacy defined by judicial defeats. So the tariffs case is existential for Trump. That's why he's calling it life or death, not for the United States, for his presidency. Second, let's talk about the food stamps case. If the Supreme Court affirms lower courts, Trump has to restore SNAP benefits. Millions of families will see their benefits restored. That's good for them, but a defeat for Trump's agenda. Trump wanted to cut spending, reduce federal benefits, and court said he can't do it the way he tried. Trump's regulatory authority gets constrained. The court would affirm that agencies have to follow statutes and procedures, that they can't just change rules unilaterally. That limits Trump's ability to reshape programs through regulation. Trump's administrative strategy fails. Throughout his presidency, Trump has tried to implement his agenda through agency actions rather than legislation because he can't always get Congress to pass what he wants. But if courts keep striking down his regulatory actions, that strategy doesn't work. So Trump is left with fewer tools to implement his agenda. Third, let's talk about the broader implications for presidential power. These cases represent courts checking presidential power, enforcing constitutional and statutory limits, refusing to let presidents act unilaterally in areas where they need congressional approval. That's the separation of powers working. That's how the constitutional system is supposed to function. If the Supreme Court rules against Trump, it reaffirms that presidential power has limits, that presidents can't just declare emergencies and do whatever they want, that Congress's constitutional powers matter, and that's important, not just for Trump's presidency, but for all future presidents. It establishes precedent constraining executive overreach. If the Supreme Court rules for Trump, it expands presidential power. It says presidents can use emergency authorities very broadly, that congressional limits are weak, that courts should defer to presidential judgments about emergencies, and that's dangerous because it reduces checks on presidential power, makes it easier for presidents to act unilaterally, undermines separation of powers. So these cases have major implications beyond Trump. Fourth, let's talk about political consequences. If Trump loses at the Supreme Court, his base will be angry. They'll claim the justices betrayed Trump, that even Trump-appointed justices ruled against him, and they might turn on the court. Attack judicial legitimacy. That could undermine the court's institutional standing. If Trump wins, Democrats and moderates will be outraged. They'll see it as the court bailing out Trump politically, as conservative justices putting partisanship over law. That could also undermine the court's legitimacy, so the court is in a difficult position. Either way they rule, some segment of the public will attack them. That's what happens when controversial presidents push legal boundaries. They force courts into politically charged decisions, and courts' legitimacy suffers regardless of outcome. Fifth, let's talk about what Trump's desperation reveals. Trump calling cases life or death, warning about catastrophe if he loses. That shows weakness, not strength. Strong leaders don't make desperate public appeals, don't warn about doom if courts rule against them. They accept judicial review as part of the system. Trump's hyperbole undermines his credibility. Judges and justices see through it, recognize that Trump is exaggerating, and that makes them less sympathetic to his arguments. Trump's run into the Supreme Court shows he's out of options. He lost in lower courts. He has no other avenues, so he's begging the highest court to save him. That's not a position of strength. Sixth, let's talk about what happens next. The Supreme Court will issue decisions in these cases, probably within months. For the tariffs case, where arguments already happen, decision could come anytime. For other cases, decisions will come as they work through the process. If the court rules against Trump, he'll have to comply. He might rage, might attack the court, but ultimately, he'll have to follow the rulings, restore SNAP benefits, stop collecting certain tariffs, refund tariff revenue, constrain his use of emergency powers, and that will be a major defeat. If the court rules for Trump, he'll claim vindication. We'll say the court confirmed his authority, we'll continue his policies. But even if Trump wins these specific cases, he's still facing dozens of other legal battles, state prosecutions, civil suits, more regulatory challenges. So winning at the Supreme Court doesn't end Trump's legal troubles. It just resolves these particular cases. Either way, Trump's presidency will be defined by legal battles, by courts checking his power, by judicial defeats, even when he wins, because the pattern is clear. Trump pushes legal boundaries, courts push back, and Trump spends enormous time and energy fighting in courts rather than governing. So what's the bottom line? Trump was hit with damning rulings in multiple federal courts. Food stamps, tariffs, emergency powers. Courts found Trump violated laws, exceeded his authority, acted procedurally improperly. Trump immediately ran to the Supreme Court, filed emergency appeals, asked justices to block lower court orders, to let him continue policies courts found illegal. Trump is calling the tariffs case life or death, warning about catastrophe if he loses, showing desperation. And Trump is waiting to see if the Supreme Court will save him, if conservative justices will overturn lower courts, if his presidency can be salvaged. But there's a real possibility the court will rule against him, will affirm lower courts, will strike down his tariffs and other policies, and that would be devastating for Trump's agenda, for his legacy, for his presidency. Trump's run into the Supreme Court isn't a sign of strength, it's a sign of desperation. It's what happens when you lose consistently in lower courts, when your legal arguments are weak, when judges across the country are ruling against you. And even if the Supreme Court bails Trump out on some issues, the pattern is clear. Trump's presidency is defined by judicial defeats, by courts constraining his power, by institutional pushback against his overreach. That's Trump's legacy. Not the strong leader he wants to be, but a president constantly checked by courts, constantly losing legal battles, constantly running to higher courts begging for rescue. Stay tuned, because Supreme Court decisions are coming, and they'll determine whether Trump's agenda survives or collapses, whether his claims of broad presidential power get affirmed or rejected, whether his presidency ends in total legal defeat or manages to salvage something. The fate of Trump's presidency is in the Supreme Court's hands, and Trump is desperately hoping they'll save him,